He believed his wife would never leave because she had spent 12 years proving she never would, but on one quiet evening inside the marble walls of the Romano estate, a single careless sentence shattered a marriage that had survived everything except being taken for granted. Claire Romano had always measured love in ordinary moments. She remembered fresh coffee waiting before sunrise, handwritten notes slipped beneath Ethan's leather portfolio, and the porch light she refused to turn off until his headlights appeared at the end of the long driveway. She had never asked for expensive jewelry, extravagant vacations, or grand public declarations. She only wanted to know that the man she married still saw the woman who had stood beside him before success had changed the rhythm of their lives. That afternoon the mansion felt strangely still. The rain tapped softly against the floor-to-ceiling windows, turning the gardens into a watercolor of silver and green. Claire balanced a porcelain cup of espresso on a polished tray, just the way Ethan preferred it, no sugar, no cream, always served while it was still steaming. It was a routine she had repeated so many times that even the house staff smiled whenever they saw her walking toward his private office. She believed small acts of kindness kept a marriage alive long after romance settled into quiet companionship. As she approached the heavy walnut door, unfamiliar voices drifted into the hallway. Ethan was meeting with his attorney, someone who had handled the family's business for years. Claire slowed her steps, not because she intended to listen, but because her own name floated through the narrow opening before she could announce herself. The attorney spoke first. "Have you considered what happens if she finally gives up?" There was a brief silence, followed by the faint clink of crystal against wood. Ethan answered with a calm confidence that once made Claire feel safe. "Claire won't leave. She keeps fighting for this marriage no matter what. She always comes back." A quiet laugh followed, soft enough to sound harmless, yet sharp enough to cut deeper than shouting ever could. "She's loyal," Ethan continued. "Sometimes I think she's fighting harder for us than I ever have to." Claire froze where she stood. Her fingers tightened around the silver tray until the delicate china trembled. She waited for him to correct himself, to explain that he admired her devotion, to say he appreciated every sacrifice she had made. Instead, the conversation moved on as if those words carried no weight at all. In that single moment, she realized the greatest heartbreak was not anger, betrayal, or distance. It was becoming so dependable that the person you loved stopped seeing your effort as a gift and began treating it like certainty. The aroma of fresh espresso rose into the silent hallway, but Claire could no longer remember whether she had prepared it because she loved him or because she had forgotten how to stop. She lowered her eyes, carefully placed the untouched cup on a console table outside the office, and walked away without making a sound. Behind the closed door, Ethan Romano continued discussing contracts, schedules, and meetings, completely unaware that the woman who had spent years protecting their marriage had just heard every word that would quietly change both of their lives forever. Claire drove without choosing a destination, letting familiar streets carry her through a city that had witnessed every chapter of her marriage. The gray sky stretched endlessly above Chicago, matching the quiet ache settling inside her chest. She did not cry. Somehow, tears felt too loud for a heartbreak built from ordinary words spoken with extraordinary certainty. At a red light, her eyes drifted toward the simple gold wedding band resting on her left hand. 12 years earlier, Ethan had slipped that ring onto her finger inside a small neighborhood church where only close friends and family gathered. There had been no orchestra, no luxury venue, no famous guests. Back then, Ethan Romano was simply a determined young entrepreneur with ambitious dreams and a stubborn belief that hard work could change his future. Claire had believed in him long before anyone else did. She remembered the tiny apartment they rented above a family-owned bakery where the scent of fresh bread filled every morning. The kitchen was barely large enough for 2 people, the furniture came from thrift stores, and their old sedan made strange noises every winter, but every evening they sat together at a folding table, sharing takeout containers while Ethan covered notebooks with business ideas that seemed impossibly ambitious. Whenever he questioned himself, Claire smiled and reminded him that success was never built in a single day. When investors rejected his proposals, she stayed awake beside him until sunrise, helping organize presentations all over again. When money became tight, she quietly sold the diamond earrings her grandmother had left her, telling Ethan she simply preferred a simpler style. He never discovered the truth because she wanted his confidence to grow without carrying the weight of guilt. As the years passed, the impossible slowly became reality. One successful contract led to another. The apartment became a townhouse. The townhouse became the sprawling Romano estate with its endless hallways, elegant staircases, and perfectly landscaped gardens. Luxury entered their lives so gradually that Claire barely noticed the change until she realized strangers now greeted Ethan with admiration before they even knew his name. Success transformed many things around them, but she believed the man she loved remained somewhere beneath the tailored suits, crowded schedules, and constant responsibilities. She adjusted her own dreams without complaint. She stepped away from a promising career in interior design because Ethan's growing business demanded flexibility at home. She hosted charity events, welcomed important guests with effortless grace, remembered birthdays for employees, wrote personal thank you notes, and quietly became the steady foundation beneath a life everyone else admired. Whenever reporters praised Ethan for building an extraordinary empire, Claire applauded from the background, genuinely proud of everything they had created together. She never needed recognition because seeing him succeed once felt like enough. Yet somewhere along the journey, appreciation slowly disappeared beneath routine. Ethan no longer noticed the fresh flowers that appeared in his office every Monday morning or the homemade soup waiting whenever exhausting weeks caught up with him. He accepted every thoughtful gesture with the absent-minded comfort of someone who believed tomorrow would always look exactly like today. Claire never stopped giving because love had become a habit as natural as breathing, but habits often become invisible to the people who benefit from them most. As she parked beside the quiet shore of Lake Michigan, the memory of Ethan's words echoed once more with painful clarity. He had not sounded cruel. That was what hurt the most. He had sounded certain. Certain that her loyalty would outlast neglect. Certain that her forgiveness had no limit. Certain that she would always keep fighting, even if she had to fight alone. The Romano estate greeted Claire with the same polished elegance it always had, yet for the first time it felt like someone else's home. The grand foyer echoed softly beneath her footsteps as evening sunlight poured through towering windows, painting warm streaks across marble floors that suddenly felt cold beneath her shoes. Housekeepers offered polite smiles, security staff nodded respectfully, and every familiar face assumed nothing had changed. Claire answered each greeting with the same gentle kindness she had shown for years because she could not bring herself to let anyone else carry the weight of what she had heard. Some heartbreaks belonged only to the people inside them. Upstairs, she paused outside the master bedroom and slowly opened the door. Every detail reflected a life they had built together. Framed photographs captured vacations, anniversaries, charity galas, and quiet weekends by the lake. In every picture Ethan stood confidently beside her, one hand resting naturally against her back, looking like a man completely certain of the future. Claire wondered when confidence had quietly become complacency. She placed her purse on the dresser and walked toward the large walk-in closet. Dresses hung in perfect order beside tailored suits worth more than they had once earned in an entire year. She reached for one simple navy sweater, folding it carefully into a small travel bag. Before stopping herself. No, she thought. Leaving was not something to do in anger. It was something to consider only after her heart had become quieter than her disappointment. She closed the bag again and returned it to the shelf. Downstairs, the grandfather clock chimed 6 times. Ethan would be home within the hour, just as he was almost every Wednesday. His schedule rarely changed. Claire knew it better than he did because she had organized so much of it herself. Normally she would already be preparing dinner, checking that his favorite jazz playlist filled the dining room, and reminding the chef that Ethan preferred fresh rosemary with roasted chicken instead of thyme. Tonight she walked into the kitchen, thanked the chef for the preparation, and gently suggested that everyone finish early because she would take care of the rest. The staff exchanged surprised glances but quietly obeyed. When the last employee left through the service entrance, silence settled over the mansion like a soft winter snowfall. Claire stood alone beside the long kitchen island, staring at the ingredients spread neatly across polished countertops. Fresh herbs, warm bread, and a bottle of sparkling water waited exactly where they always did. For years she had believed love was found in repetition, in choosing the same person every day even when life became complicated. Now she wondered whether repeating the same kindness without being seen slowly erased the person offering it. The sound of tires rolling across the circular driveway reached her through the open kitchen window. Ethan had arrived. Instinct urged her to greet him at the front entrance the way she always had, but her feet remained perfectly still. Moments later the front door opened, followed by the familiar rhythm of his footsteps crossing the foyer. "Claire," he called casually, expecting her cheerful answer. None came. He loosened his tie while walking toward the kitchen, checking messages on his phone without looking up. When he finally entered the room, he paused with mild surprise. Dinner was waiting exactly on time. The table had been set with quiet elegance. Candles glowed softly beneath the crystal chandelier. Everything looked perfect except for one detail that Ethan could not immediately explain. Claire was sitting by the window with a book resting unopened in her lap, her hands folded peacefully together, her expression calm enough to hide every crack forming beneath the surface. She smiled politely as he entered, the same graceful smile she had worn for years, but something invisible had disappeared from her eyes, and because he had spent so long believing she would always be there, Ethan Romano failed to notice that the woman still sitting across from him had already begun quietly walking away. The meal unfolded with the quiet precision of a tradition repeated so many times that neither of them questioned its rhythm. Crystal glasses reflected the warm glow of candlelight while soft jazz drifted through hidden speakers, filling every corner of the dining room with familiar comfort. Ethan spoke occasionally about meetings, new partnerships, and a charity gala scheduled for the following month. Claire listened with the same patience she always had, nodding gently whenever he looked up from his plate, yet her responses became shorter than usual. She no longer asked the thoughtful questions that once encouraged him to slow down and share more than the headlines of his day. She simply listened, and Ethan accepted her silence as easily as he accepted everything else she had quietly given him over the years. When dinner ended, Claire carried the empty plates toward the kitchen before he could thank her. She had noticed something almost amusing in its sadness. Ethan had thanked business associates, waiters, and even the valet parking attendant countless times that week, yet somehow the person who cared for him every single day had become invisible to simple words of appreciation. It was not cruelty. It was habit. And habits, left unattended, often became the architects of lonely hearts. The following morning the mansion awakened beneath golden sunlight pouring across polished hardwood floors. Ethan stepped into the kitchen expecting the rich aroma of fresh espresso waiting beside the morning newspaper. Instead, the counter was spotless except for the coffee machine, resting exactly where it belonged. Claire sat near the breakfast nook, reading quietly while sipping tea from a white ceramic mug. She smiled warmly when he entered. "Good morning." Her voice remained gentle, carrying no bitterness, no accusation, no hint of the storm hidden beneath her calm expression. Ethan glanced toward the empty counter before looking back at her. "Did everyone oversleep?" he asked casually. Claire looked up from her book with peaceful eyes. "The coffee maker is working perfectly. I checked it earlier." Her answer was polite, almost cheerful. Ethan laughed lightly, assuming she was teasing him. He walked to the machine, searching for the coffee beans she had always prepared the night before. They were exactly where they belonged. Everything necessary had been available all along. The only difference was that Claire had stopped doing what he had unconsciously expected her to do for him. A few minutes later he poured himself a cup, discovering it tasted almost identical to the one she had prepared every morning for years. Still, something felt strangely different. The silence between grinding beans and pouring coffee seemed longer than usual. As he buttoned his jacket before leaving for work, he noticed another small change. His briefcase remained beside the front door, but the folder containing documents for his afternoon meeting was not tucked neatly inside as it always had been. It sat on the entry table exactly where his assistant had delivered it the evening before. Claire had not forgotten. She had simply stopped anticipating needs that no one acknowledged. Ethan collected the folder himself, barely thinking about it as he headed toward the waiting car. Behind him, Claire stood near the front window watching sunlight illuminate the circular driveway. She did not wave goodbye. She simply watched until the black sedan disappeared beyond the front gates. Then she closed her eyes for a brief moment and released a slow breath she had been holding since the previous afternoon. She still loved her husband with every quiet corner of her heart, but love was beginning to teach her a lesson she had resisted for far too long. Fighting for a marriage did not always mean holding on. Sometimes it meant discovering whether the other person would finally notice when you stopped carrying the entire weight alone. Days slipped quietly into one another, and the changes inside the Romano estate were almost impossible to notice unless someone had been paying close attention from the very beginning. Claire continued treating everyone with the same warmth she always had. She thanked the housekeepers by name, remembered birthdays, arranged flowers in the front hall every Friday, and greeted every employee with a genuine smile that never revealed the private storm she carried. The only person who failed to recognize the difference was the man whose opinion had once mattered most. Ethan remained absorbed in conference calls, board meetings, and endless schedules that stretched from sunrise until late evening. He still expected the household to move with effortless precision because it always had. Yet tiny pieces of that invisible perfection had quietly disappeared. His favorite navy tie was no longer waiting neatly beside his suit every Monday morning. The dry cleaning still arrived on time, but it remained hanging inside the closet exactly as the service delivered it. His tablet battery was no longer fully charged before early flights. His preferred sparkling water no longer appeared inside the back seat of the car before long business trips. None of these changes created real inconvenience. They simply required him to pause for a few extra moments and take care of things himself. Each task lasted less than a minute, yet together they introduced something unfamiliar into his carefully managed routine. One Thursday afternoon, Ethan returned home earlier than expected after a meeting ended ahead of schedule. The mansion was unusually peaceful beneath the golden light of late afternoon. Expecting to hear Claire playing the piano in the sitting room, he slowed his pace without realizing it. For years she had practiced the same collection of classical melodies while waiting for him to come home, filling the enormous house with quiet life even on the busiest days. Today the piano stood closed, its polished surface reflecting empty chairs and silent windows. Ethan paused for a brief moment before continuing upstairs, telling himself she was probably out shopping or reading somewhere in the garden. He found her instead inside the small library overlooking the backyard. Claire sat comfortably beside the window with a blanket folded across her lap, turning the pages of a novel while a cup of chamomile tea rested untouched beside her. Sunlight framed her face with the same gentle warmth that had first caught his attention years ago, yet something about the scene felt strangely distant. She looked peaceful in a way he had not seen for a long time. It was the peacefulness of someone who had stopped waiting for another person's footsteps to determine the rhythm of her own day. "You are home early," she said with a pleasant smile. "The meeting ended ahead of schedule," Ethan replied. He remained standing in the doorway longer than necessary, almost expecting her to close the book and ask about his day as she always had. Instead, she placed a bookmark between the pages, set the novel aside, and waited quietly for him to continue if he wished. The silence stretched comfortably for her but unexpectedly awkward for him. Ethan cleared his throat. "I thought you might be playing the piano." Claire glanced toward the garden outside the window before answering softly. "I realized I had forgotten how much I enjoyed reading in the afternoons." There was no resentment in her voice, only honesty. Ethan nodded, unable to explain why her simple answer unsettled him more than an argument ever could. As he walked away, he found himself glancing back one last time. Claire had already returned to her book, completely absorbed in its pages. For the first time in many years, Ethan Romano experienced a feeling he could not immediately name. It was subtle, almost impossible to describe, like entering a familiar room only to discover that the warmth had quietly left long before anyone noticed the temperature had changed. Autumn settled gently over the Romano estate, covering the long stone pathways with shades of amber and gold that seemed almost too beautiful for a home growing quieter with each passing day. Ethan noticed the silence before he understood its cause. It lingered in the hallways after sunset, followed him through rooms that had once felt welcoming, and waited patiently beside him every evening as though asking a question he could not yet answer. Claire was still there. She still smiled. She still treated him with kindness. Yet the invisible thread that had once connected every part of his life to hers had begun to loosen without a single dramatic word. One Friday evening, Ethan arrived home carrying a small paper bag from a bakery across town. Years earlier, Claire had mentioned that their cinnamon rolls reminded her of the neighborhood shop they had visited during their honeymoon. He had happened to pass the bakery after a meeting and bought two without thinking much about it. As he stepped into the kitchen, he found Claire arranging fresh flowers inside a crystal vase. Sunlight from the western windows painted soft golden light across the room, making everything appear peaceful. "I brought these home," Ethan said, placing the bag on the counter with a faint smile. Claire looked pleasantly surprised. "That was thoughtful. Thank you." She opened the bag, smiled politely, and placed the pastries onto a serving plate. Ethan waited, expecting the excitement she once would have shown over such an unexpected gesture. Instead, she simply prepared two small dessert plates and invited him to sit. The cinnamon rolls tasted exactly as he remembered, warm, sweet, and comforting. Yet the conversation that followed remained gentle, respectful, and strangely weightless. Claire no longer filled every silence with stories, questions, or quiet laughter. She seemed content allowing stillness to exist between them, while Ethan discovered that stillness could become unexpectedly heavy. Later that night he wandered through the house unable to concentrate on work. Passing the music room, he noticed a thin layer of dust beginning to settle across the closed piano. Claire had not played in weeks. He opened the lid carefully and pressed one key. The single note echoed through the empty room before fading into silence. He suddenly realized he could not remember the last time he had actually stopped to listen whenever she played. The melodies had become part of the background of his life, appreciated only after they disappeared. The next morning Ethan prepared coffee before Claire came downstairs. The process took only a few minutes, but somehow the kitchen felt unfamiliar while he measured beans, waited for the machine, and searched for the mugs she always placed exactly where he needed them. Claire entered wearing a simple cream-colored sweater, her hair loosely tied back, carrying another novel beneath her arm. She smiled when she saw him standing beside the coffee maker. "You are getting very good at that," she said warmly. Ethan laughed softly, though something inside him tightened. "I guess I should have learned years ago." Claire nodded with quiet sincerity. "We are never too old to learn new habits." Her words sounded ordinary, yet they lingered with him long after breakfast ended. Throughout the weekend Ethan caught himself noticing dozens of things he had overlooked for years. The fresh towels folded perfectly inside every guest room. The handwritten cards Claire mailed to elderly relatives every month. The homemade soup she quietly delivered to a retired employee recovering from surgery. The flowers she refreshed before they ever wilted. None of these gestures had disappeared because she had become unkind. They disappeared because she had finally begun reserving some of that care for herself. For the first time since hearing his own careless confidence reflected back through another person's question, Ethan Romano found himself wondering whether the greatest mistake in his marriage had never been a single cruel sentence at all, but thousands of grateful words he had simply never spoken. Monday arrived wrapped in cold rain and low gray clouds that blurred the skyline beyond Ethan's office windows. Meetings filled every hour of his calendar, but for the first time in years his concentration slipped away from contracts and financial reports. During a presentation, one of his senior executives asked a simple question about an expansion proposal. Ethan stared at the projected numbers without hearing a single word. His thoughts drifted instead to Claire's quiet smile over breakfast, to the untouched piano, to the unfamiliar silence waiting inside the house every evening. He had spent years believing stability required no maintenance because it had always been there. Now stability felt strangely fragile. He ended the meeting earlier than planned and instructed his driver to take him home. The estate appeared exactly as it always had, elegant, orderly, and peaceful beneath the steady rain. Yet something inside him urged him to step away from routine. Instead of walking directly toward his office, Ethan wandered upstairs, passing rooms he rarely entered during the day. His footsteps eventually carried him to the small sitting room beside the master bedroom, a place Claire had transformed years ago into a quiet retreat filled with books, framed family photographs, and soft afternoon light. On the side table rested a leather journal he recognized immediately. He had given it to Claire on their 10th wedding anniversary, encouraging her to write down ideas for the travel memoir she had once dreamed of publishing. He remembered teasing her that one day the world would want to read stories through her eyes. The journal lay closed with a folded envelope resting neatly on top. His name was written across it in Claire's graceful handwriting. Ethan hesitated before picking it up. The paper felt surprisingly heavy in his hands. Inside the envelope rested a single page. There were no legal documents, no accusations, no dramatic declarations. Only a quiet letter written with the same care Claire had poured into every ordinary day of their marriage. Ethan slowly began to read. Dear Ethan, if you are reading this, it means you have finally become curious enough to notice what has been changing between us. I want you to know that this letter was never written out of anger. Anger burns quickly. What I have been carrying has taken much longer to grow. I used to believe that loving someone meant giving everything without keeping score. I still believe love is generous, but I have learned that generosity cannot survive forever when it is mistaken for obligation. I never needed perfection from you. I never expected grand speeches or impossible promises. I only hoped that one day you would notice I was still choosing you every morning. The hardest moment of my life was not hearing that you thought I would never leave. It was realizing you sounded completely certain because I had taught you that no matter how lonely I became, I would always stay. That certainty broke something inside me that I do not know how to repair. I have fought for this marriage with all my heart, but somewhere along the way I realized I was standing alone on the battlefield. I am tired, Ethan. Not because I stopped loving you, but because love cannot keep asking one heart to carry what belongs to two. Ethan lowered the page, unable to continue for several seconds. Rain tapped gently against the windows while the room remained perfectly still. He looked around at the shelves Claire had arranged, the photographs she had carefully framed, the blanket folded over her favorite chair, and for the first time he saw not decorations but years of quiet devotion woven into every corner of the home they had built together. In that silent room, surrounded by countless expressions of love he had accepted without truly seeing, Ethan Romano understood that the greatest distance between two people was not measured in miles, but in the unnoticed sacrifices that slowly disappeared until there was nothing left to give. Ethan folded the letter with trembling hands and placed it back inside the envelope as though it contained something far more fragile than paper. He remained seated in Claire's favorite chair long after the afternoon light had faded, surrounded by memories he had spent years walking past without truly seeing. Every photograph on the shelves carried a story she had quietly preserved. Every framed ticket stub, handwritten recipe, and pressed flower represented moments she believed were worth remembering, even when he had been too busy chasing the next achievement to notice them. For the first time since building everything he once thought mattered, Ethan realized he had confused providing a beautiful life with participating in it. The mansion had become larger as the years passed. But somewhere inside its endless rooms their conversations had become smaller. He left the sitting room just before sunset and found Claire standing alone in the greenhouse behind the estate. Soft lights glowed beneath the glass ceiling while rows of orchids and white roses filled the warm air with a gentle fragrance. She wore gardening gloves dusted with soil, carefully trimming a fading blossom from one of her favorite plants. Ethan stopped several feet away, uncertain how to begin. Confidence had always come naturally to him during negotiations, public speeches, and difficult decisions, yet standing before the woman he loved suddenly felt like the hardest conversation of his life. Claire sensed his presence and turned with the same calm expression she had worn for weeks. "I was wondering when you would find the letter," she said quietly. Ethan looked down before meeting her eyes again. "I should have found it much sooner. I should have found everything much sooner." She removed her gloves slowly and placed them beside a watering can without speaking. The silence between them no longer felt empty. It felt honest. Ethan stepped closer, leaving several respectful feet between them. "I have been trying to understand when I became the man who could hear your kindness every day without listening to it." Claire offered a faint, tired smile. "It did not happen all at once." He nodded. "I know. That is what frightens me the most. I cannot blame one bad day or one careless sentence because this happened through hundreds of ordinary moments that I never noticed." His voice grew softer. "The words you heard outside my office were real. I said them and I cannot take them back. What hurts me now is realizing they were not just careless. They were proof that I had started believing your love required nothing from me in return." Claire's eyes glistened beneath the warm greenhouse lights, but she remained composed. "Do you know why I did not argue with you?" she asked gently. Ethan slowly shook his head. "Because I had already spent years speaking through my actions. I made your coffee. I waited for you. I celebrated every success. I forgave every absence. If all of those things could not tell you how lonely I had become, then another conversation would not have changed anything." Ethan felt every word settle heavily inside his heart. There was no accusation in her voice, only truth spoken with quiet dignity. He reached into his jacket pocket and removed his phone. Without hesitation he turned it completely off and placed it on a nearby table. Then he removed the watch that governed every hour of his professional life and set it beside the phone. "For years I gave every important meeting my complete attention," he said. "Tonight I want to give that same attention to my wife. Not because I am afraid of losing you, but because I finally understand how much of you I have already failed to see." Claire looked at the silent phone, then back at Ethan. For the first time in many weeks, she noticed something that had been absent from his eyes for a long time. He was no longer standing before her as a powerful man accustomed to solving every problem. He was simply a husband willing to admit that love could not survive on certainty alone and that respect always begins with learning to truly listen. The conversation inside the greenhouse lasted until the last traces of daylight disappeared beyond the glass walls and the evening settled softly over the Romano estate. Neither Ethan nor Claire tried to force quick answers because they both understood that a marriage slowly neglected could not be repaired by a single heartfelt apology. Instead, they remained where they were, speaking more honestly than they had in years. Ethan listened without interrupting as Claire described the quiet loneliness that had become part of her daily life, the countless mornings she convinced herself tomorrow would feel different, and the gradual realization that she had begun disappearing inside a relationship while standing only a few feet away from the man she loved. He resisted the urge to defend himself because for the first time he understood that explanations could never replace understanding. Days turned into weeks, and something unexpected began changing inside the house. Ethan did not make dramatic promises or expensive gestures designed to erase the past. He simply started showing up. Every morning he prepared breakfast before Claire came downstairs, often laughing at his own imperfect attempts to cook the recipes she had mastered years earlier. He rearranged meetings so they could share dinner without phones resting beside their plates. When she played the piano again one quiet Sunday afternoon, he remained seated in the music room until the final note faded into silence, applauding softly with genuine admiration instead of walking past the open door as he had done so many times before. One rainy Saturday they returned to the small neighborhood bakery where they had once spent precious dollars on a single cinnamon roll to share. The owner recognized them immediately despite the passing years and smiled warmly as though no time had passed at all. Ethan looked around the modest shop with quiet emotion, remembering the young couple who had believed happiness could fit inside a tiny apartment and a borrowed future. "I spent years trying to build us a bigger life," he admitted as they sat near the window. Claire reached across the table and gently rested her hand over his. "You did build a beautiful life," she answered softly. "We just forgot that the people inside it mattered more than the walls around them." Ethan lowered his eyes for a moment before meeting hers again. "Thank you for staying long enough to help me understand that." Claire smiled with quiet honesty. "I almost did not." Those 4 simple words settled between them with more weight than any speech either of them could have given. Ethan nodded slowly because he knew she was telling the truth. He had not earned another chance through status, wealth, or success. He had been given one because someone he loved chose hope one final time. Months later, employees throughout the Romano estate noticed subtle changes that no renovation could ever create. The front porch light no longer burned late into the night because Ethan made sure he came home before darkness settled whenever he could. Fresh flowers still appeared throughout the house, but now he often carried them in himself after stopping at the local florist. The piano filled the hallways once again, and this time another sound frequently accompanied it. Ethan's quiet laughter as he listened from the doorway. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the gardens in shades of gold, Ethan and Claire stood together on the back terrace watching autumn leaves drift gently across the lawn. Neither of them spoke for several peaceful minutes because some moments were too complete for unnecessary words. Ethan finally reached for Claire's hand, not out of habit, but with the quiet gratitude of a man who understood how close he had come to losing something priceless through simple neglect. Claire intertwined her fingers with his, and together they watched the fading light without needing to look anywhere else. Sometimes the strongest marriages are not the ones that never break. They are the ones rebuilt by 2 people who finally learn that love is not proven by who keeps fighting the longest, but by choosing every day to fight for each other before silence has the chance to speak in their place.